for joining us tonight for our next episode of MMTed Q&A. Tonight our special guest won't come to you via Zoom. We're going to have something a little bit different. I was in Melbourne this week and I took advantage to catch up with Joshua Dalton, who's the convenor of the Modern Monetary Discussion Group in that city. And Josh came to MMT from a scientific background, and he had a lot of questions some years ago about the way in which the Australian economy was evolving and the opportunities that were being presented for his generation that didn't make sense to him. And so he started on a journey by asking a few questions about things that didn't make sense to him. And that's how he discovered MMT, and he's since become very active in the MMT community in Melbourne. So while I was in Melbourne, I caught up with Joshua and we managed to meet observing appropriate social distancing, and this is what transpired.
Right, so thank you for having me along today, Bill. I really appreciate this chance to sort of explain a layman's interest in economics and why I've come to view the MMT analytical framework as a valuable lens through which to view the economy. My interest in economics developed from somewhat of a historical perspective, I suppose. I grew up with the awareness that in previous decades, the government was able to fund things like free university education, it was able to run utilities, and a lot of those services were privatized or sold off for various reasons. And so I was really interested in that question of, well, why were these services once affordable for us as a nation and have since become unaffordable? And so I started to delve into that question, and it raised a lot of questions about the surrounding components of orthodox economics. So,
But you hadn't studied economics, had you?
No, I hadn't studied economics at all. I'm a scientist by trade, actually. So economics, some of the mathematical components I can comprehend, but it's completely left field for me, really. I guess my first question really, where does the money come from? Why is the government so constrained in this present day and age, whereas before, take the Second World War, we were able to fund that effort as a colonial nation, which was still using horses for a large component of our transport system. How is that possible?
And this is a question that a number of people ask, and so it's a good way of starting our conversation today. A lot of people buy into the idea, and this has been massaged and built up by the mainstream of economics, that the government is like a household. The idea is that we try to understand the way a government works by drawing on our experiences as households. And so as householders, we know that if we want to get money to buy things, then we have to go to work. We might be able to save some of our income, and as a consequence, we can have some more spending capacity in the future if we give up some of our capacity now by consuming less now. We can occasionally go on eBay and sell assets and get some money that way, and that just reflects things we've bought in the past. And then for the big things like buying a house, which is typically the largest thing we buy in our lives, particularly my generation, not so much yours anymore, unfortunately. We have to borrow. We can be income rich when we're young, spend more than our incomes, and over our lifetime we pay it off. And so that's a very powerful understanding that we have as citizens. It's got an intergenerational bias the way I've expressed it, because I'm a baby boomer and you're not. And you're probably not going to have the same opportunities because of the way in which society has moved, particularly in terms of real estate. But that's still an experience that we all relate to, the fact that we're financially constrained and we need to get income before we can spend. That household budget analogy is really used in a very powerful way by those who are pursuing a conservative agenda with respect to governments relative to the market, to try to get us to think that the government's just like us, it's just a big household. The problem is, of course, is that the government isn't a big household. It's different in the most elemental way because we use the currency that the government issues, and the government is the only one that issues its currency. It's a monopolist in the economic jargon. It's the only entity that can issue that currency. So when you think about that, if it's the issuer of its own currency that we use, then the idea of translating our experience to understanding the capacities and the constraints of the currency issuer, it doesn't rub. As a currency issuer, it has no financial constraint. Where does its currency come from? Mostly a digital phenomenon that the government creates by essentially typing numbers into bank account. Some people talk about it comes from thin air. At any point in time, it can spend that currency into existence and provide us with the use of that currency, and the motivation for doing that is to shift productive resources from the non-government sector into the government sector so that the government can provide services, build infrastructure, and it has to get the real resources to do that, labour and capital, and from the non-government sector, and it does that by spending its currency and hiring procurement and public servants and all the rest of public activity. And so by doing that, it is putting currency into the system. So in a way, it comes from nowhere, but that might mislead. It comes from the fact that the government is the currency issuer, and it has no financial constraint. It can buy whatever is available for sale in its own currency at any time it chooses. And the real constraints on government spending are what is available for sale. These are the resources it wants to transfer from the non-government sector to the government sector so that it can run its agenda. That's the constraint. And occasionally the government can come up against those real constraints. If we have a fully employed economy, then obviously if it wants to spend more and command more of those resources, then it's constrained. But it's not constrained by having a shortage of its currency. It's constrained by the fact that we're all using the resources it wants to get its hands on. In that context, it has to work out a way to deprive us of the use of those resources so they can be used by the government sector, and that's a role for taxes, for example. There are other ways it can do it, but if it levies a tax and reduces our purchasing power, then that creates idle real resources that can be then brought into productive use. Because if the government doesn't do that and just tries to bid for those resources at market prices, then there will be inflationary pressures in the economy. So the answer to the question, where does the money come from? It comes from the government. It's got unlimited quantities of its currency, and the currency enters the economy through typing in numbers in bank account. And so any alleged financial constraints on government, which are bandied around all the time, are purely political and reflecting the ruling ideology of the day.
Thanks for answering that question, Bill. I suppose my next question is, and something I thought of when I was learning about economics, is why does the government issue government debt then? Is it really debt in the conventional sense? Would you be able to fill me in on what that might actually be?
Yeah, that's a great question. The two questions that people always ask when I say to them that the government isn't financially constrained: why do they issue debt and why do they levy taxes? They're the two big things, and they're great questions because they go to the dissonance that the statement the government isn't financially constrained introduces to people, because they've been conditioned to think that the government's like a household, and so the taxation is the income and issuing debt is like having a home mortgage. And so that experiential sort of leap is perfectly cognate to them. That's the way they've understood it, and they've been encouraged to understand that in that way by people who want to limit the activities of government. particularly over the last few decades, that have shaped your opportunities and brought you to searching for answers, this so-called neoliberal era. There's been huge ideological constraints imposed on the way the government operates to limit the ability of governments to provide for full employment, proper provision of public infrastructure, public education, schools and all of that. And so these are sort of the standard questions that people who are confronted with, well, the government has no financial constraints. What does that mean? Why do they tax? Why do they issue debt? To understand the debt issue, you've got to go back really to the period after the Second World War. The grand consensus reached by nations in the peacetime to create financial stability and to create the conditions for growth of material prosperity, which included full employment, public infrastructure and the growth of public education and those things. And so they decided to create the fixed exchange rate system called Bretton Woods system. And the fixed exchange rate system required the central banks to intervene in foreign exchange markets. That's where all the currencies are traded with each other to facilitate trading, purchases and imports and exports and those things. They set parities against the US dollar for each of the currencies, so they were valued at X number of Australian dollars per US dollar, and the US dollar then was fixed against the price of gold, an ounce of gold. In that context, the central bank always had to be adjusting interest rates and the liquidity available in the economy, the currency available in the economy, to make sure there wasn't too much or too little. Because, for example, if there was too many Australian dollars in the world relative to the demand for those dollars, that would put downward pressure on the currency in the foreign exchange markets, which would require the central bank then to intervene and drain out that excess supply of Australian dollars. So domestic policy, setting of interest rates, and the fiscal policy, how much spending in net terms the government was going to do relative to its tax take, was always compromised by the requirement that the central bank had to maintain the agreed value of the Australian dollar in the international market. And so fiscal policy, which involves spending and taxation, was always calibrated or had to be calibrated against what the central bank was doing. And so if the government wanted to run a deficit, which means they were going to be spending more than they were taxing, then in ordinary circumstances that would push too much of the currency into the economy and would create problems for the central bank, because too much currency would drive the currency value down on international markets, and that would lead the central bank to have to either push up interest rates to attract capital inflow, which would then reduce the supply of Australian dollars, or it had to do other things to reduce the supply. And so it was understood that in that context, to run a deficit, the government would have to drain the currency by issuing debt. The debt was not to finance the spending, but to drain any excess liquidity that arose from the deficits. Now, in August 1971, President Nixon abandoned that system. He effectively, and it's a separate set of discussion we won't go into, what motivated that. But the Bretton Woods system basically collapsed at that point. It took a little while longer for it to completely collapse, but that was when the big shift occurred. And we entered a monetary history period, which we call the fiat currency system. Exchange rates floated, and different countries floated at different times. Australia waited until 1983, so 12 years after approximately. But by floating the currency, the central bank was no longer bound by any agreements to compromise domestic policy. So under the Bretton Woods system, a country that was running consistent trade deficits would always be facing downward pressure on its currency, because trade deficits mean that there's more Australian dollars being supplied into the world than are being demanded. Countries that were running trade deficits, for example, were always facing the fact that fiscal policy would have to be relatively tight to reduce imports and slow economic growth, which had the negative consequence of elevated levels of unemployment. And the central bank always had to be pushing up interest rates, which had a similar effect of suppressing domestic activity. And after 71, the domestic policy settings were freed from that problem. And at that point, the need to issue debt as a way of controlling liquidity disappeared. So the question then is, why did they continue issuing debt? And the answer is, it became an ideological agenda. And what I mean by that is that when we floated the currency in 83 in Australia, we also created new institutions for issuing debt. And I won't go into the details. At the time it was said, well, why are we doing it this way? And the answer was to provide a discipline on government spending. The public don't really understand bond markets and government debt. They draw on that experience of their own household budgets, and they know that if you have too much debt, you get into problems. That's a powerful metaphorical device to have a political agenda where your debt level goes up. That's in some way signifying an out-of-control spending program, that the government are losing discipline. And so the reason we keep issuing debt when it's totally unnecessary now, because it doesn't fund the government spending, is because from a political sense, we know that you can leverage negative political sentiment for a government that's pushing up debt. Now, the other reason governments issue debt is because they're under extreme pressure from the financial market to provide a risk-free asset to the financial market that allows them to park funds when there's uncertainty, buying government debt. So whenever there's a major economic downturn, the demand for government bonds booms because everybody knows that it's risk-free. The governments who issue their own currencies can always fund their liabilities. The financial markets demand debt as a sort of insurance, for call that the corporate welfare function of debt. That's why governments issue debt, for those sort of reasons. In an analytical sense, they don't need to issue debt to fund their spending. The government is not like a household. It's an unnecessary, quite a resource-intensive activity to issue debt. So the pure MMT position is that the government just should stop issuing debt.
Thanks, Phil, for that very clear and concise explanation. It does raise a lot of other questions, but I'm not sure they're about economics anymore.
Okay, that's it for tonight. Thanks very much for joining us. We'll be back next week with more questions and hopefully some more interesting answers. In closing, I just want to thank all of those who have made donations to MMTed so far. We really appreciate that and thank you. MMTed relies on public donations to build our capacity and to get us in a position where we can offer courses free of charge to the general public. We hope to start floating courses in September of this year. So if you can help, we really appreciate it. Thank you. Until next week, see you later.